meeting open to the public and welcome members to the 44th meeting of the Committee for Finance in the 22-27 mandate. And I'm pleased to welcome everyone to South Down, to Kilkeel here in my constituency. It's great to get out of Stormont once in a while, and especially to my constituency, so everyone's very welcome. I advise members that this committee meeting will be recorded, but it's not being broadcast throughout Parliament buildings or online as usual. I advise members that those in the public gallery are welcome to use mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode and all devices are muted. They can connect to the hotel Wi-Fi password and details are available on request. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. Agenda item 1, apologies. I inform members that apologies have been received from Matthew O'Toole, our chair, who is on paternity leave, and Philip Brett is running a little bit late and will join us shortly. Agenda item 2, declaration of interest. All members are obliged to declare any relevant financial or other interests at each committee meeting as applicable. Have members any relevant interest to declare?
No. Thank you.
Thank you. Agenda item 3, chairperson's business. 3.1, Kilkeel Banking Hub. I refer members to page 6 of the meeting pack. Members were provided with some logistical information provided in advance of today's visit and external meeting. And item 3.2 at page 10 of the meeting pack, members will find a briefing paper provided by Cash Access UK in relation to the Kilkeel Banking Hub. And I would seek agreement that it is added to the committee's evidence base for the inquiry. An inquiry report in due course. Great, thank you. So just wanted to say that I felt that the visit to the hub had went very well. It was quite informative and they took a lot of time to answer our questions, both from Cash Access UK, from the management of the hub and the different banking organisations. I find it very worthwhile and can add a good bit to our inquiry. And just wondered, any members like to add or reflect on it, Steve?
Yeah, just thanks very much indeed. There was one particular bit I would probably like to get some more information out from Access. We're talking about how the hub was funded, and they said it was through the banks and it was based on the UK size of the mortgage book that was paying for them. I just would like to know how the hubs in Northern Ireland are being paid for, if that's the same way, because obviously there's a different arrangement. I'd just like to have a bit more detail about how they are funded.
Sorry, Clarke.
Chair, as far as we're aware, it's the same arrangement. The banks are, as was said in the hub, the contribution is relative to their size, but our understanding is that it's a UK-wide funding model. So we'll seek more details on specifics for the hubs here, whether that's obviously more of a local bank representation, although we'll check and make sure, is it mostly them that's providing funding for those, or if it's just coming from one big pot.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Yep, okay. Anyone else? No?
Again, just it was really good to go and see it in person, obviously meet the team that are operating it on a daily basis. I'd be keen to get more information as well in terms of those, how they make the assessment if they're going to put a hub in. So I know they touched on demographics and things like that, but just to understand that a wee bit more, particularly as we are, moving forward, and I suppose trying to get a sense from them in terms of other areas of work or services that they want to provide. So I know the fella from Ulster Bank touched on, having like a concierge type service. So because these hubs are new, are they picking up any, future developments or areas of work that they would like to progress? So just to try and get a better understanding of that, I think would be useful.
Yeah, definitely. And as she said, that the rapid pace at which they've been growing, just as their time to actually feed back into it. But I think that's all good things to add. And I just want to take the chance to say thanks to our Assembly Clerk team for arranging the visit. I really, really appreciate it. I know a lot of work goes into that and arranging this here as well. Gemma?
Sorry, Chair, and I don't want to labour the point, but as I raised about Lisnaskea being refused, because obviously, so their last bank closed in, I think it was May 24, and the criteria changed in October 24. So because of that, they've been told, no, you're not allowed a banking hub. But Lisnaskea is the second biggest town in the county of Fermanagh. Yeah. So I know, and it's obviously not going to be the only town that's affected, or, across the north. So I would like more information or a wee bit more clarity on that, because it just doesn't make sense that a town of that size has been left with no access because the criteria changed. after their last bank closed. So
Yeah, I think, had they put a written submission into our inquiry? Because it's a couple of things maybe we could just put questions to them for follow-up clarity, because we said it whenever we were out at the hub, and I think it's an important point as there's only 5 in Northern Ireland. It's quite new for us here. It's really good to be able to share the information, especially under the new requirements, that we're able to advise other members and promote awareness of what they're doing. So maybe what do we do if we say no? Because for Liz Ski to have been said no, she has said that you can't have another application within 12 months. It's quite a long time. So to try to understand the process has changed in the meantime, if the last bank had have closed in September, October, there would have been a different circumstance. So maybe to ask her for some a little bit more written guidance that we can share and distribute it right across the Assembly.
Sure, we might actually couch it in those terms, because I'm just very conscious of some of the evidence sessions that the committee has had. It's not a well-known thing. People don't really know about banking hubs. You've got a cluster in a particular area than a few others. So what I might actually ask is if they can give us the information that members have already highlighted, but more that we can feed out to MLAs generally, because I think members are going to have a huge interest in how this works and how to get these opened up in their own communities. So we work for that, Chair.
And clarity on reasons for refusal. And I would be content to use Liz Ski as an example to actually ask through this committee for, could you explain why second, biggest town in that area has been said no, especially whenever the criteria's changed in the meantime. I think it would be a fair example to use in terms of that. Is everyone content with that?
Yeah, Chair, that would be a classic case study there of how it didn't work. So, getting deep down into the criteria and why they refused it.
Yeah, I think it would be good, because if you're putting the report out of the committee, we can say we visited Kilkeel, it was the first one, here are the things that are going well, but we've got an example of something that didn't work well for an area.
We follow up on that, Chair.
Is everyone content? Yeah. Thank you. And thanks again to the team for organising it, and it all went very well. So moving on to item 3.3, our Minister of Finance 24-25 pay award implementation. Refer members to page 13 of the meeting pack and highlight to members that the committee has received an update from the Minister on the 24-25 Northern Ireland Civil Service Pay Award. In January, a 20-month pay offer covering the period 1st of August 2024 to the 31st of March 2026 was made to the recognised civil service trade unions, in all of which have now consulted with their members and accepted the offer. Officials are planning to make payment of the awards to staff, with payment of the 2024 award in May salaries and the 2025 award expected in September. Details of the award are included in the correspondence from the Minister. Ask members to note unless any member wishes to comment or raise any further queries. No? Content? Thank you. Item 3.4, Hospitality Ulster. I refer members to page 15 of the meeting pack and highlight to members that the committee has received correspondence from the Hospitality Ulster requesting an opportunity to brief the committee on its perspective on the recent UK budget and implications for the hospitality sector in Northern Ireland. I would seek members' views on scheduling such a briefing in light of the committee's current work priorities. It might be useful to have an informal session, potentially online, with Hospitality Ulster.
Yeah, I would encourage us to meet with Hospitality Ulster because of the things, the cost of doing business, cost of living, and what happened yesterday, the 1st of April, with regards to the national insurance hike and the minimum wage increase. So I do think it's pertinent at this time. It would be timely to meet with Hospitality Ulster.
Okay.
Yeah, I would second that.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll seek to schedule, Chair.
Yeah. Obviously we've got our joint motion on Tuesday. It'll cover a number of those issues. So if you're happy to. Yeah. Okay. So we'll seek agreement then to indicate to Hospitality Ulster the committee's agreed position. Yeah. Thank you. So agenda item 4, with draft minutes of the meeting held on the 26th of March 2025. I refer members to page 17 of the meeting pack. Are members content that the minutes are a true reflection of the proceedings of the meeting held on the 26th of March 2025?
Content.
Yeah, content? Okay, sign the minutes. We got them?
We got those, Clarke? No?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. So agenda item 5 is matters arising. Item 5.1, the Committee for Infrastructure Final Budget 25-26 proposals. I refer members to page 36 of the meeting pack. The Infrastructure Committee has requested that this committee copy it into any future correspondence regarding the Department of Infrastructure in relation to Budget 25-26. I seek members' agreement to this request. Agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you. Item 5.2, the Executive Office Committee, Outstanding Common Frameworks. I refer members to page 37 of the meeting pack. The Executive Office Committee has copied information to this committee regarding outstanding common frameworks and stages of implementation. It is indicated that the majority of the common frameworks will be implemented in final form by spring 2025. I think it's useful to have this in this format, and I would ask members to note this correspondence unless any members wish to comment. No? Okay, thank you. Item 5.3, Alzheimer's Society response to the 25-26 budget consultation. I refer members to page 44 of the meeting pack. The committee has been copied into the Alzheimer's Society's response to the 25-26 budget consultation, and this was also emailed to members. I ask members to note, and I would ask for agreement that the response is added to the appendices of the committee's budget report, which was published on Friday the 28th of March. Agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. The report will be emailed to all MLAs through the ECP system, and outstanding responses will be added to the appendices in advance of the debate, which is scheduled for Tuesday the 8th of April. So moving to the tabled pack. Item 3.5, the Minister of Finance independent review of need, terms of reference. So we refer members to page 3 of the tabled pack. The Minister has provided a copy of the terms of reference for Professor Holtham's independent review of need. A report is expected in April, and the committee can expect a further update in due course. I think it's really useful to have. It's quite a lot of detail. I think it was Owen had asked for this in the last meeting, so we got it quite promptly. So I would seek members' agreement to note this update in terms of reference.
Yeah, great.
Okay, thank you. Moving to agenda item 6, SR 2025-69, the Pensions Increase Review Order, Northern Ireland 2025. Refer members to page 55 of the meeting pack for a clerk's cover note and relevant papers. The Department has formally laid an SR to make provision for the annual increase of official pensions. The order is not subject to Assembly control and will come into operation on the 7th of April. At the meeting last week, the 26th of March, the committee was content to note the proposed rule, and officials have indicated that there have been no changes to the policy content since then. I seek members' agreement to note this SR.
Agreed. No.
Thank you. And at the meeting on the 26th of March, the committee agreed it had no objection to SR 2025-50, the Government Resources and Accounts Act, Northern Ireland 2001, Estimates and Accounts Designation of Bodies Order 2025, and SR 2025-55, the Public Service Pensions Revaluation Order Northern Ireland 2025. At that time, it was understood that the end of the statutory period for both was the 5th of May. However, this was incorrect. The correct date was the 6th of May, and I ask members to note this updated information.
Okay, happy to note.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving to agenda item 7. Okay. Thank you. So agenda item 7 are Northern Ireland Banking and Financial Services Landscape joint oral briefing from local chambers of commerce. So I would seek agreement that Hansard should report this oral briefing.
Agreed.
Great. Okay, thank you. So refer members to page 67 of the meeting pack for a clerk's cover note, to page 71 for Newry Chamber Annual Report 2024, to page 86 and 93 for Warm Point Burn and Restraver Vision and Key Priorities booklet and terms of reference. And today in the meeting, I'm pleased to welcome representatives from the Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce here to the Finance Committee. We've got Alan Knox, the President of Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce. Alan, we'll invite you to come forward. Also supported by Donna Cunningham and Ryan Ward there, so everyone's very welcome. And Alan, we're really pleased that you're able to come and speak to us. We're obviously having our inquiry on Northern Ireland banking and financial services landscape, and keen to hear from you and how you feel the issues are affected in Kilkeel, and would invite you to make some opening remarks.
Yeah, I just thank you all for coming down in Kilkeel. I hope you enjoyed the visit. You brought the good weather down with you. Particular thanks to Diane. I imagine you've been a spearhead to get them down to Kilkeel, so thank you very much, and to the clerks for organising it. As you can see, the banking hub, the first in Northern Ireland, to me it has been a great success. But only comment would be is the need for it. The need for it was that we had 2 local bank closures within a year. They occurred within a very short space of each other. 12th November 2021 was the AIB closure, and then 16th of September 2022. So that left us as a rural community with no banking facilities. Our closest banking facility with relation to AIB was in Newry, and the same with Danske Bank. So as you can imagine, you've all travelled down here. We're at the end of the road, so it's definitely very much a rural setting. It has negatively impacted the town, the 2 closures. You walk down the street there to the banking hub, you pass the two buildings. They're 2 beautiful buildings on our high street. As a result of the closure, they've had an impact on local business and all. The banking, both banks, they don't just employ banking staff. Them staff shop locally. People who travel to them banks spend locally. So with the closures, you're encouraging them to spend elsewhere, and it has a negative impact on our town. Now, the banking hub, Heather and Amy Dorn, who run the banking hub, they run the post office, and us as a business, from my point of view, they've been fantastic in filling that void. But there's no doubt about it is a void with the bank's closures. There's still stuff that you're unable to do even with the banking hub, that people have to still travel to Newry for. So I'll give you an example. My business, I deal a lot with farmers. I have a farmer who's in the middle of the almond season. He's had to take time out to go to travel to Newry, and he said it was best part of 2.5 hours. The time he travelled to Newry, done what he needed to do to wait and come back, and it's time that he couldn't afford to spend, but he had to do it as a necessity. So I can see your point of view, listen ski. You would have the same situation, I imagine. That's right across Northern Ireland. So to me, as finance committee, I think hard questions need to be asked about banks closures, and especially in rural aspects of it. When AIB was a big shot, we competed. The Kilkeel Chamber, along with Kilkeel Development Association and the Sea Source, we put up a campaign to save our bank, and we're actually the only ones in Northern Ireland who've done it. I can't believe other towns didn't do it. And we had a head of retail down at a meeting and all, and we put our cases forward. I had a lot of big hitting businesses behind us who would have banked with the IB and all. Again, there was no change. Once they had their decision made, that was it. Kilkeel, the way it was always put to me, would have been one of the last closures because of the fishing port. AIB would have been very well supported within the fishing industry. So it was a shock. As I said, we put a strong campaign together forward, along with a local person, Ewan Atchison, who stood outside the bank for 2 weeks solid and collected signatures and all. I can't remember what the total signatures was, but he'd done that off his own bat. So, as I said, it's definitely had a negative impact on the 2 closures for us. If there was other cases that, in a rural aspect, there's bank closures impending, I would have a serious consideration about how that's going to affect their high streets too.
Okay. So, thank you, Alan. We were just wondering if Ryan and Donna wanted to come forward and join you there. You're happy enough?
You got the hard question.
It's okay, Jerry doesn't bite. He does not bite.
That's fine. Yeah, that's okay. No, thank you very much, Alan. And I think in terms of our committee and this inquiry, it's the fact that banking and some of these financial services are not devolved to Northern Ireland. You know, they're still, you know, managed centrally at Westminster. So our inquiry is trying to come to grips with what are the Northern Ireland specific issues, and, you know, what can we gather together, what can we represent, and, you know, what the needs are here. And just some of the feedback that we had got in previous sessions from the Cash Access UK was that whenever we're looking at the feedback from the Kilkeel banking hub compared to mainland, there's a much higher proportion of businesses banking through that than they would have in a whole lot of their other banking hubs. And just wondered, where you've got the banking hub and where you don't have the banks, what do you think specific needs people have in terms of local businesses in Kilkeel and the rural area from accessing their banks?
Well, I think it's a need of support. It's a face-to-face transactions. You're completely missing them with the bank closures. So if us as a business owner had a query, traditionally you would have went to your local bank and you would have got it dealt there and then. The banking hub, yes, you can do your cash transactions, your lodgements in the banking hub, but it's that face-to-face transaction or face-to-face meeting with the representative from the banking hub. Now, thankfully, AIB have finally agreed to sign up for it. Maybe been forced to sign up for it. I don't fully know, but if you talk to anyone who's dealing with AIB or Danske Bank, they're the busiest days of the week within the banking hub, because there is a need for that support. From a business, I'm speaking from a business point of view, but I'm also speaking from a private point of view as an individual who lives in the local area. So, in regards to what do businesses need as support, it's probably getting that a relationship with a bank manager. It's sort of lost now because your bank managers are elsewhere. They're in Newry, or in my case, the bank managers in Portadown. To find out, I have to get them on the end of the phone if I can get them sometimes, in order to gain that support of what we need there and then, because sometimes it can be I need information there and then. I can't afford to wait till an email comes back today or tomorrow. So you've lost that with regards to closure to the banks.
And Alan, we have the banks themselves representatives coming in. I think it's next week. Next week, so we'll get to speak to them directly, because obviously, you know, here we have in Kilkeel we have the access to the banking hub and a little bit of face-to-face access. But you know, it's not the banking hubs that decide that. It's, you know, the business decisions of the banks. So we'll be keen to hear from those. And I just a final one from me. So you had mentioned, you know, the farmer and other ones, and I know myself from being local to here. Whenever you're travelling to Newry, then for your main bank, are you getting feedback from businesses that those banks are a lot busier now? Because I know myself, whenever I would be travelling up to Newry to go to that bank, if I needed to go to it, there would be quite a queue. So not only are you travelling the 40-50 minutes, you know, to get there, it's busier because, you know, the smaller branches are closed.
Yeah, by all means, the feedback I get is it's a lot busier. As I said in that example earlier on, yes, you're 3/4 of an hour travelling to Newry, but it's the wait in the queue because they're having to deal with a lot bigger population now. So there's no doubt about it is busier. Now, thankfully, with AIB or Danske Bank, you're dealing with people who used to work in the town, so you had that relationship. But if you had a case where it was a complete new bank team that you're dealing with and all, years of relationships there have been completely lost, and their know-how of your business, that's been completely lost. Now, every business is different. Your local banks would have been able to cater for your needs specifically, whereas if it's a universal approach, that there is completely gone. Thankfully, we maybe negated that a wee bit because our local the ones who are locally employed with the bank have moved to Newry. At relative terms, you can say it's close, but you know yourself, Dan, it takes a lot of time out of your day that you maybe can't afford to do, and at the end of the day, it's banking hours that you have to cater for.
Yeah.
So you have to leave your business and all during business hours in order to do banking.
Just when you say about the business hours, I know they had mentioned at the hub that they're keeping, a live review on the fact that it's Monday to Friday, 9 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that if either the hubs or the banks themselves made more moves to have evening or weekend sessions, that would make a
I
big
definitely
difference?
think evening sessions would be more than welcome if that's the case of it's maybe once a month or so. The other thing that maybe would be is that you can actually pencil in a meeting.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to the banking hub, you have to wait in the queue, and there's only one representative. Kilkeel is only one meeting room within the banking hub, so if there's a queue already of 4 or 5 people in front of you, you don't know how long that's going to be. So you might have to just turn your heels and go, and you've lost that for the week because it's the following week before they're back again. So I think that could be especially. Imagine there's data there of how many people they're seeing each day. If there is busier days in particular, which I know there is there a need for a second member of staff in that particular bank? Which I believe there will be. Now, I think going forward, if banking hubs are looking at that issue, maybe it is a matter of putting 2 meeting rooms in. That's a necessity.
Yeah. And as they had said earlier, that their model going forward is the 2 meeting rooms, and we all saw when we were there how busy AIB were this morning, so we would definitely saw the example.
But maybe it's worthwhile asking the question, is it possible for businesses, say, to arrange actually meetings at meeting time, because it would make it a lot easier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Alan. Jerry Carroll.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks very much. I suppose, obviously, being an urban MLA based in Belfast, West Belfast, different experience for me and my constituents, but I think obviously if you have no banking services, a hub will be essential and important for people. But I kind of raised this at the session earlier, that I'm concerned that banks are using it as a way of saving money, essentially. And obviously, the overheads of the big, nice former bank buildings in this sort of town obviously would probably cost a bit of money to run, and I'm concerned that banks are kind of just moving towards banking hubs as a way to protect their finances. And I just note Danske Bank made £218 million profit in the North last year. That way, 6.2 billion, and Ulster Bank is part of that. So these are obviously not small organisations, are making a lot of money off the backs of customers. So it's a service that sort of your members and people you work with support. I'm just concerned that it's being rolled out as a replacement for bank and branch closures. And just the gentleman that you pointed to, I mean, there's been a bit of pushback from the Financial Services Union, the union representing workers in banks against closures, but quite often they've kind of railroaded them through. So more of a comment and a question, but yeah, thanks for raising it.
I fully accept your comment because I agree with it. So it's a way of them cost saving, no doubt about it. If this is the future, we'll have to deal with it, but within your committee or finance, it can't be a matter of he's pushing back on it and say he simply can't close a bank. I don't know what powers there be there, but yeah, I would agree with you. They have to employ less people to run a banking hub. They're putting 1 member of staff in instead of 3 members of staff a day. So yeah, I would agree with your comments.
Well, I think that community pressure is vital. People don't always win or aren't always victorious, as unfortunately was the case here. But I think if you don't organise or fight, then you're already sort of beat and snookered, so to speak. But yeah, thanks for raising it.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. And Paul Free.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for coming along, Al, today. It strikes me that Kilkeel is a town. You see where the banks used to be. You can see it very clearly because banks are usually structured. The architecture of a bank is usually different from a retail unit, and it won't always lend itself for other businesses to go into. So you're left then with 2 magnificent buildings that are basically derelict in the town centre. What sort of effect has that had on the town of Kilkeel? And as the Chamber of Commerce, any thoughts as to how Kilkeel can rescue that situation?
So, yeah, your comments in regards to magnificent buildings banks tend to be magnificent buildings because all the money was there.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, this end of the street has greatly suffered from the dereliction of the two banks there. Thankfully, they're good working order, if you can say that, for a building. However, in my understanding, there is planning for a change of use within the bank. But again, going back to planning authority, there's a lot of red tape that's holding that up. So that's something that needs to address. I know it's out with this remit, but in regards to dereliction, Kilkeel Chamber are part of the local economic partnership that was recently launched, and that's something that we're actually actively looking at. There's going to be a study done in Kilkeel about derelict buildings, and there's one that was recently done with Newry Chamber, so there was, and Kilkeel's going to. So we're going to try and identify what the problems are with the derelict buildings. Is there planning applications in, and how this local economic partnership can help address them problems. But I think the retail environment, the high street environment, has completely changed, as you all well know, in the past 10 years. It's thinking outside the box. It's no longer just high streets or just retail. Any report and all you read to says high streets need to be a mixture of retail, hospitality and living, and that's an issue where the living conditions come under play because of change of use. It's not easy to change of use from a retail environment to apartments, so it's something that I think needs to be addressed in order to save our high streets, to prevent any more dereliction, because as you well know, once you have one or two buildings, it's very easy that there cascades to a lot further buildings to get into that state, because people simply won't invest.
Yeah, just when you've just triggered my memory there, because in Ballymena we lost the Bank of Ireland, which was a grand frontage, and they've actually turned that into apartments.
Yeah.
So that might be a case study that Kilkeel might want to look at. Now I don't know how they're doing it, because the Bank of Ireland had obviously safe houses and vaults and one thing and another, so there's probably a lot of change inside the building which we haven't got into yet, but they've built out the back, and they've created the apartment block, which basically means there's more living in the actual town centre.
Yeah.
So it's not beyond hope that something like that can happen, but I just know that dereliction has a massive impact on town centres.
Massive is. Going back to the financial point of view, it's an impact on local councils, because you've lost the rates on that building. So if there's no incentive to address the dereliction problem and to solve it, it's just going to lie there forever until something is actually done or forced to be done about it. As I said, if buildings such as the AIB Bank or Danske Bank are left for a prolonged period of time, then it will get to a stage where it would be viable for them to be addressed the problem. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at.
Do you think it is the right model where all the banks are bought into the hub and then they contribute by 1 day a week, having one staff member in the bank? You said earlier that it just wasn't ideal compared to what a bank could provide a service for. There was a conversation earlier with regards to having someone who would be employed full-time that would represent all of the banks. So instead of an agent of a bank coming for 1 day, moving off, and then you're only going to get seeing that person 1 day a week, would it be better that there would be someone permanent, not counter staff, because that's a different service, someone in there who would go into that interview room and be there permanent 5 days a week, and then represent or be able to represent all of the banks? And would it be better then that if there was to be an increase in employment, and maybe roll that into 2 staff members, that you could see where you could crank up into what would actually look and feel like a bank?
Yeah. To me, I don't see how it could be viable for one representative to represent all different banks, because in my understanding, each bank operates in completely different ways. Yes, in theory, I think it'd be fantastic that you have one dedicated banking member as opposed to a counter staff. But I don't see how that would work in practice. But go back to my point and your comments you made. I think two members of staff is near enough needed. And go back to Jerry's point in that their banks are looking to reduce their overheads and all. It's a cost-effective way for them to scale up through the banking hubs. Yes, it's maybe not what we want, but if that's what our cards were dealt with, then I think that would be beneficial. Going back to 2 members of staff, with regards to a permanent member of staff to represent them all, I don't see how, if that is what is being talked about and all, they have more insight and more experience than I do with regards to the banking sector, but I don't see how that would work.
With banks in the past, with businesses working with banks in the past, trust was a massive issue. You used to get to know your bank manager when you started a business, and you usually walked alongside that bank manager for the whole of his career and all of your business career. That's gone now. But is there still an issue, do you think, with banking hubs that could well take time to build up trust?
Yeah, I think it's very much dependent on who is running the banking hub. The trust was already there because it was 2 local women who are running the hub. Now, I didn't only recently I discovered that they had to go through quite a lengthy interview process in order to do that there. I thought it was near enough a given that they would be doing it as the post office staff. So I think if there's a new banking hub set up and somebody completely different from the area that nobody knew about coming in, I think they would find it very hard to gain that staff or to gain that sort of trust and the relationship. As you said, yes, you walked along with your bank manager through your business life. And our personal experience and the business experience, we've changed our bank manager 4 times in the past 5 years. So we've lost that complete relationship. The understanding of them having us as a business and how we operate, we might operate slightly old school, but our previous banking manager knew how we operated and were able to provide a service that catered for that. If it's a complete, it's like trying if it's a new banking manager within the business and the business has been operating for so long and the same member of staff and a new person is coming in, they might be trying to push a service to them that's not needed or is completely would prohibit the growth of the business. So I think, yes, I agree with your comments. That relationship with the bank closures and the banking hub is lost. Thankfully, in Kilkeel, but it hasn't been as widely felt because the relationship has been there. But I can see how that can be an issue going forward.
Sure. Thank you very much, Al. Thank you.
Okay, I think that there's maybe a question when we're talking about asking for a wee bit more information of cash access, feeding on from the point Alan made well, that the success of the Kilkeel Banking Hub has been largely dependent on the fact that it was the local postmaster, that was able to take it on, because they had said earlier in the session that that's where they try to go first, but if it's not successful, they go wider. So I would be interested to know, in Northern Ireland and across the board, how many of them were able, to be taken on by the local postmaster, just when we're asking for a wee bit more feedback. And I just wanted to ask you, Alan, just as you were speaking, it came to me, as the president of the Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce and the wider Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce, is there any means by which the Kilkeel Banking Hub and Cash Access UK engage with yourself as to feedback as to how it's been going? Because we heard a lot today about how they sprung from 5 to 122 really, really quickly, and they're rolling out this model, but is there a mechanism by which they're taking local feedback and how it's going or what they can improve?
In relation to cash access,
yes,
or just the banking hub specifically?
No, the cash access, because they're the ones rolling it out.
We had the Kilkeel Chamber and Cash Access had a very close relationship in the development of the banking hub when it first came about, especially when we were trying to push for AIB to join. There was countless meetings from when the hub set up, we've had very little dealings with cash access. Now, I would deal personally with Amy and Heather within the banking hub. I would see them pretty much at least once a week and ask them how it's going. Us as the chamber have sort of been pushing out social media posts or even to word of mouth to local businesses about the banking hub, because I think there's been a misunderstanding of how people can use the banking hub. They think that, say, for instance, if it's Barclays one day or Danske one day, they can only do Danske transactions that day, whereas over the counter, as you all well know, you can do any transaction with any bank. So it's getting that information out. But it probably, the relationship with cash access, it probably could be improved, maybe from the chamber point of view, in order to promote the banking hub a bit more. We do it ad hoc because we have a relationship closely with the banking managers. So it's maybe, yes, going forward with cash access, how they can tie in with local business groups in order to keep on promoting the banking hub, or maybe a change of service or change of hours. As I said, we pick up on that through a personal relationship rather than a business relationship.
Because I think that you're making a lot of really good and sensible suggestions in terms of meetings for businesses, a separate room for businesses, and the pressures that's felt. So I would just be concerned if they're rolling them out quickly without taking that feedback. There's improvements that could be made. So it's definitely something we could note in. Steve Aiken.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed for coming and giving evidence. There are just a couple of specific ones. When you said, Kilkeel's at the end of the road and, we're sort of a rural thing, but you've got some really big industries here. You've got Collins, which is, the second largest manufacturer of seats anywhere, full stop. I mean, it's a major business.
Yeah.
And the fishing industry, you've got lots of fishing boats, and you've got lots of sort of small businesses built around that. So it's actually quite a vibrant sort of economic hub.
Yeah.
And not to have banking facilities. So I take it, and I was just reading through the sort of the paperwork, sort of Newcastle's gone to a banking hub, Warren Point's gone to a banking hub. So you say you bank yourself in Portadown?
So our business bank account's Portadown.
Yeah. So even though there's such a large amount of economic sort of activity going on here in Kilkeel and the wider area, the banks don't feel as if it's worth their while to get involved in.
Well, it's going back to the previous comments in that we were very shocked that AIB had closed the account. 90% of the fishing industry banked with AIB. And previous AIB bank manager had stated at the time that Kilkeel would be the last AIB branch closed because it's so successful. So, yes, you've mentioned Collins Aerospace and all. Kilkeel's, yes, will have a fantastic industry but it's also fantastic SME industry. So there's a lot of local generations and local businesses that are third, fourth, fifth generation businesses. So to see how it wasn't viable to run a bank was very confusing because there was a great business, or it is a great business around here that would have used the bank on a daily
So where do the
basis.
SMEs go to get sort of investment opportunities and loans?
You have to reach out to, well, a lot of them don't know where to go, and that's a big issue that us as a chamber are trying to address. In order to grow, if you're an SME and you've been established and all, yes, you maybe have that relationship with the previous bank and all, but if you're trying to start off a business and all, where to turn to is a minefield. How to get support from a bank, because if that relationship hasn't developed with a member of a bank and all, they'll maybe not say yes to that investment or that loan, whereas previously they could have done.
Yeah.
So I think that's an issue. It's probably not just Kilkeel, it's probably Northern Ireland in general.
Yeah.
Are the banks actually supporting SMEs?
I think we know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Yep. And the other one is a sort of through your indulgence here. A lot of the crews on the fishing vessels are sort of foreign nationals and be sending money back home via money transfer.
Yeah.
How do they do that with no banks?
I believe it is through the banking hub that they're being able to do that there. I wouldn't have detailed experience in that, but I believe it is through the banking hub, or they have to go to Newry to do that. And if it is to Newry, it's public transport they have to rely on.
Which is
Which is, as a rural setting, it can be difficult. So it is. So again, you've lost that gateway in order to facilitate that transaction. So it is with the closure of the banks.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Thanks.
Gemma Doe.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming in to us today. Can you just expand on what work was done to get the hub to Kilkeel? Did you just do a basic application like cash access we're talking to us earlier about, or?
So, in regards to the banking hub to Kilkeel, maybe it was through the finance committee, because as far as we were surprised when the banking when cash access announced that Kilkeel was the chosen.
Oh right, okay.
Us as a chamber we weren't aware of the banking hub or cash access, so it didn't apply to become a banking hub. Our thoughts were it was either through a committee such as itself, or because we actually had done the campaign in order to save the banking hub, and it had gained traction. That was on Radio Ulster, and so the surprise that Kilkeel was chosen, thankfully it was chosen, and we're greatly accepted. But how that ever came about, I'm not too sure.
Okay, it's okay. That's all my
My understanding of it at the time was they were looking to come to Northern Ireland for the first one, and it was that they looked at Northern Ireland, and there was a lot of press at the time, very recently, of all the banks being closed in the town. It just targeted it that way. It's just fortunate and glad to be the first in Northern Ireland to get something here. Deirdre Hardy. Oh, sorry,
right,
Steve.
Just very quickly, just for a point of clarification, was the hub set up before or after the law changed?
Oh, before. It was the first one
okay.
here. Yeah, first one in Northern Ireland. Yeah. Deirdre?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Alan, and to your colleagues as well, just for coming in. I think that it is useful, especially because we do have the banks in front of us next week as part of the inquiry. And I suppose a question I wanted to ask was, with a reduction in service, and particularly the face-to-face interaction in service, have you seen a reduction in your fees or charges from the bank in terms of businesses?
Most definitely not.
That's good.
I can.
It's gone up.
It's definitely gone up, and I think I don't think Kilkeel's just the only town. No, there's a lot of businesses who are cash only, and there's a reason for that because the charges are so high.
Yeah.
I always find it strange. You have to pay to lodge cash in. You have to pay to take cash out. We've lost 2 cash machines within the town with the 2 closures. It's went from 7 down to 4 at the minute. Last summer, we had temporary. It was 3 cash machines, and all 3 were out of action. The closest cash machine was in Rostrevor. So, it was full weekend. There was no access to cash. So that was very problematic. So it was. I know from our business setting, who people are coming in who we've actually seen a slight rise in people using cash with our business sector. And that's we have to deal with our card transactions.
Yeah.
They're through the roof.
The cost as well.
Yeah, the cost of it. So it's something we have to factor in, but. No, our banking fees have definitely not decreased, that's for sure.
I think it's just a useful area to probe with banks next week. The other bit is around, obviously, because when you look at, obviously when legislation was brought in to try and look at banking hubs as a way of trying to intervene, when that went through Westminster, I mean, some of the issues that have come up, particularly for rural areas, it's not even just the bank closures, it's even access to proper broadband. So you're being hit numerous times.
Yeah.
With additional barriers in terms of trying to do business or go about your life. So it's just to get a sense of the issues that local businesses here are being impacted by, because obviously, as you say, SMEs are the bedrock of our local economy. That's something that we want to continue to grow. Obviously, within the economy department and stuff as well, looking at local economies and that regional balance piece, is so critical as well. So it's to get a sense of the issues around broadband connection. So even if the banks are saying more going online, is that a challenge for areas like Kilkeel, and if so, how? One of the other areas I've seen with a reduction in banking services is that you can also see a reduction in productivity levels. because obviously if businesses are spending, could take the guts of 3 hours if you're nearly trying to add it up by the time you get into Newry, you're waiting maybe in the queue by the time you get back. That could be potentially 2.5, 3 hours out of your day. So are you seeing any impact on productivity in terms of the local businesses that are here as a result of those closures?
Okay. To address your first question in regards to connectivity to broadband, it is an issue because we're in a rural setting, there is black spots.
Yeah.
If you go to Colleen, to hear more about, or down to Newcastle, there's a 3G, 4G, 5G black spot. So if you live in any of them houses, or you run a business within houses, which there is businesses out in both directions though, they do have issues. If you try to do a banking transaction, you need a 5G connection.
Yeah.
You need to spend online, you need to put in a PIN from an app on the phone. So from a business point of view and from a societal point of view, especially elderly who maybe do not have an Android phone or an Apple phone, they simply can't do banking. Because in today's world you need a phone that is capable of doing that. So yes, that is an issue. The connectivity, broadband, the reliance on a good, stable broadband connection is crucial in order to run a business.
Yeah.
Without it, irrespective of banking facilities or how to run a business, no, you need it. Second, you're right. Sorry, the second part of the question.
Productivity, just with the reduction in.
If you have to spend 2 or 3 hours out of your business, your productivity definitely decreases. It's even more so if you're a one-man business, which a lot of the local businesses are. That business just ceases to exist for them 2 or 3 hours. Especially if, say, in a retail point of view, that business might have to close in order to facilitate their banking. So instead of doing a 5-10 minute job that would have previously been a no-brainer just up the street, they've had to actively, I'm going to close for half a day here in order to do my banking. So it hits businesses by doing that. Yeah,
and particularly in rural areas, which our demographic is in terms of the north. The other issue then was around, that's what I wanted, it's in terms of obviously knowing the local bank manager, and as you say, you may still have that relationship in Newry, but if you look in 10 years' time, those personnel changes and it wouldn't be the same. So is that having an impact then in terms of access to lending, for example? Is that more difficult now because you don't have that direct access face-to-face? You know, they get to know you and your businesses and the other way around. So if it is the fact that you have to go to Portadown for that, or you have to try and get them on the phone because they're dealing with a bigger pool of businesses. So is that having an impact? Are you picking up issues around access to lending, even beyond access to just everyday cash? Are there difficulties there? Are there delays in that then that has a knock-on effect in terms of the businesses? Are you seeing any trends or any,
I think the trend you see is a rise on internet-only banking as a result of the lack of banking facilities. So people who are maybe dealing with Sterling or Monzo or Revolut, they're going down the business route because they don't have an existing relationship or are unable to develop a relationship because there's a lack of business or banking managers there. So you would see, I would know a lot of business locally who have went away from traditional banking sector to go online only banking sector because they maybe find it easier to use in their business. And to them, what's the difference between using an online person who's elsewhere compared to a person who's up the street who hasn't a clue, or sorry, not up the street, but in a city elsewhere that hasn't a clue of how their business operates. So yes, I think you'll see a trend in that they're moving away from banks who would have been traditional banks and also banks that would have been supportive of in the Northern Ireland sector.
And be keen to see as well, I mean, obviously these are choices by banks in terms of their profit margins and all of that, and that's just how they're doing it. But obviously, as I say, there was the Financial Services and Markets Act, which did try and build in some protections, where the banks do have a social responsibility then, even as private businesses. So if there was additional amendments to that legislation, I mean, have you thought around what additional supports could be built in, even beyond the banking hubs, or if the banking hubs could change, if they're here to stay? Have you thought of any additional kinds of support that would work then for local businesses here? Because I know one of the key issues we've seen right away, they're only in 1 day a week. You don't get to see them around the clock. One of the other issues is you have to have your own tablet or phone. So as you say, even for older people, if they don't have that, then you don't get the access to the service, even in the hub.
Yeah.
So it's just to see what other gaps, that you have identified, or what would you like to see. Obviously, ultimately, the bank's coming back, but if that doesn't happen, what further protections do you think potentially could work?
I think, going back to the point earlier on, maybe a dedicated member of staff, as a business member of staff, would be a crucial aspect. Picking up on your point about need your own tablet and all, I think the banking hub should be able to facilitate that you can access through their system. The other issue, I don't know if it's raised at the banking hub, there's no printing facilities.
Yes, that was raised.
So
they're
if you have
piloting, I think, a couple of areas.
So if you have to submit, and they're not allowed to take documents from you.
Right.
Documents have to go to Newry. You have to hand documents into Newry. The banking hub cannot take documents.
Yeah.
Members of the staff can't take documents from you. So if you're to submit documents, you have to go to Newry in order to do that.
Anyway, then, even
so I think issues like small issues like that there, I think, can be very easily addressed. But in regards to business point of view, I think a dedicated member, a business member,
yes, who's located.
Located.
That'd be useful, thank you. And I suppose if you think of anything else, because granted we're fair in all these subjects as well,
I think on the spot.
It would be useful if there's anything you want to feed into the committee. Even as I say, and particularly in advance of the banks and stuff coming in next week as well, that we can put this to them in a live committee session. I think would be really useful to have that lived experience out on the ground. So thank you.
Thank you. No one else. So thank you very much, Alan. It's been really, really informative and some great evidence for us for our inquiry, and also just thank you on a local basis to yourself and your colleagues at Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce for the great work you do. Everyone in the committee can see how proactive and engaged you are, giving really valuable feedback like that. So just want to say thank you very much for joining us today and doing this. And if everyone's content, I ask members' agreement that we pause our recording to we take a couple of pictures with the Chamber of Commerce before we recommence.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. If you want to pause us.
Thank you. Meeting is reconvened, and thanks again to Alan Knox, President of Kilkeel Chamber of Commerce, for coming and giving evidence. And we have apologies from Michael Savage of Newry Chamber and Colleen Tinnelly from Warren Point, Burn and Rostrevor Chamber of Commerce. So we just note those. I can refer members to page 94 of the meeting pack considered earlier, the briefing from Cash Access UK on the Kilkeel Banking Hub, and at page 97 of the meeting pack, members will find a copy of the survey results from Retail NI, a call for action, a 5-point plan to tackle the cost of doing business crisis. Retail NI has requested an opportunity to brief the committee fully on the results of this survey and associated proposals for the reform of business rates. Retail NI are calling for fast tracking of Department of Finance proposals to reform the small business rate relief scheme, a reformed hardship fund, an additional rate levy for very large out-of-town retail superstores, and a scale-up rates relief scheme. There are also calls for a strengthened town centre first retail planning policy, a recall of the High Street Task Force, tougher fines and sanctions for shoplifting, and the establishment of a cost of doing business advisory forum. I would seek members' views on scheduling a briefing. We discussed earlier the hospitality Ulster, and to me the two almost go hand in hand. I know we've got a busy
through the chair,
workload,
that's what I was going to suggest, that we schedule them both together.
Yeah, okay. Would members be in agreement?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it might be an opportunity to schedule it at the same time as the department is briefing the committee on the domestic rating supplementary consultation with members in agreement. Okay, thank you. I would ask for agreement to copy the survey results to both the Infrastructure, Executive Office and Justice Committees for information given the cross-departmental nature of the issues.
Great.
Agreed. Thank you. So moving to agenda item 8, the financial transactions capital. We have an oral briefing from Raise and I refer members to pages 101 and 125 of the meeting pack for the 2 research papers prepared by Raise as commissioned by the committee, one on FTC usage and challenges, and one on private financing and capital redevelopment projects in government. And I would welcome Dr. Karen Clarke and Dr. Rachel Keys here to Kilkeel today. Thanks very much for coming and joining us. It's great to have you here. And I would invite you to make some opening remarks.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to work through each section of the first paper and then pass over to Karen to work through the second paper. So the first paper focuses on FTC and challenges. Financial transactions capital is a form of funding provided by the UK government which is designated for loan and equity investments in private sector entities, and unlike grants, FTC must be repaid and is expected to generate a financial return. The overarching rules governing the FTC are determined by the UK government and are set out in Chapter 8 of the UK Consolidated Budgeting Guidance. And the UK government also determines the amount of FTC that devolved administrations receive through the process set out in the Statement of Funding Policy, which determines the allocation of Barnett consequentials. So subsection 1.2 of the paper outlines some benefits and risks when partnering with the private sector. So some of the benefits include benefiting from private sector technology and innovation, supplementing limited public sector capabilities to meet the growing demand for infrastructure development, and being able to extract long-term value for money through appropriate risk transfer to the private sector over the life of a project. But there are a number of potential risks. Those include development, bidding and ongoing costs of projects are likely to be greater than for traditional government procurement process, and so a determination would need to be made as to whether the greater costs involved are justified. Some projects may be easier to finance than others, and ultimately the government responsibility continues, so citizens will continue to hold government to account for the quality of services. Government also need to retain sufficient expertise in order to run the projects. Initially, the private sector is likely to have more expertise, so it's important to ensure that there are clear and detailed reporting requirements imposed on the private operators to reduce a potential imbalance in capabilities. Moving on to section 2 of the paper, it offers a comparative perspective outlining FTC usage in England, Wales and Scotland. So FTC first came about in 2012-13 when the UK government announced a range of housing-related equity and loan finance schemes in England, such as Help to Buy, and the type of funding used to operate such schemes was financial transactions, or FTC. In England, the funding is ring-fenced for the specific programme for which they are allocated. However, when those investments are in areas which are devolved, the devolved administration receive a proportional share of the investment through the Barnett formula, and devolved administrations may decide on their own programmes within their FTC allocation. Moving on to subsection 2.2 of the paper, this looks at FTC usage in Wales. So Table 1 shows that FTC funding returned to the UK government from Wales is pretty minimal. Table 2 then shows how the Welsh Government used FTC funding, and it shows that the majority of the funding was used for a Welsh Help to Buy model or allocated to the Development Bank for Wales. Last year, in 2024, the Senate Finance Committee completed an inquiry into FTC, and despite the seemingly high level of success in Wales when using FTC, the Welsh Government identified a number of challenges relating to its use. So firstly, the way FTC is allocated by the UK Government is highly uncertain and volatile, which subsequently causes difficulties for the Welsh Government when planning for its use in the medium to long term. Bids for FTC tend to be inherently either riskier or provide lower financial returns when compared to wider investments, as otherwise they would use private sector loans, which are often easier to access and less expensive. The lower financial returns mean that if a bid fails to repay its funding, it will compromise the wider Welsh Government FTC portfolio overall. And additionally, even after being awarded FTC funding, policy officials need to work with legal and commercial teams within the Welsh Government to develop contracts for funding partners, and it can take time to upskill staff for this task. The increased level of scrutiny and assurance needed for FTC investments can disincentivise the development and submitting of bids compared to regular grant funding. Consequently, most new funding proposals considering FTC generally don't do it as a first port of call. It's usually when they've exhausted all other alternative funding models. Moreover, repayable loans create an administrative responsibility within government, and this increases the budgetary risk for both the area that the bid falls within and also for the government centre who are responsible for the repayments. Providing an appropriate level of scrutiny to bids can be particularly challenging given the short turnaround between the autumn statement when the FTC allocation is given and when the draft budget is produced in December. And this leads to a reliance on a small number of policy areas which have used FTC before and they're most effective at managing and mitigating risks. The report did note some best practices, so things like having a clear strategic objective, robust governance and oversight, the ability to maximise recyclability of funds, effective stakeholder engagement, and then transparent reporting and evaluation. And the committee inquiry made 15 recommendations, all of which were accepted by the Welsh Government, and these are outlined in Table 3. So moving on to FTC usage in Scotland, Table 4 of the paper shows FTC underspending per year, and it should be noted that underspending and funding return to Treasury are not the same thing, so it's not comparable to the Welsh data, and some level of underspending can be carried forward to the next financial year.
Okay.
Table 5 then shows what the funding was used for, and it shows the majority of FTC funding in Scotland was used for a Scottish housing schemes or for rural loans. And it should be noted that there was not a great deal of publicly available information on FTCs pending in Scotland, and this was confirmed whenever we contacted our research counterparts in the Scottish Parliament.
Just to interject, sorry, apologies to the Chair. That rural loans, was that part of the buyback of the Crofters buyback scheme, was it?
I'm not actually sure what it's in relation to. I think it's to do with the cap loans that were stopped there before they were stopped here.
Yeah. So it's recycled into agriculture?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I had a scrutiny point just on that. Maybe the committee would want to look into this further. Obviously, we had our ring fence removed for rural support this year. So maybe it's something the Agriculture Department may want to look into if that's something we can use FTC for going forward.
And they didn't have a difficulty of reclassifying it?
No, it's still FTC.
Yeah, I suppose so.
It's FTC funding, but it's a loan, it's not a grant.
Yeah, okay.
So it would differ in that aspect.
Yeah.
Section 3 of the paper then looks at FTC usage in Northern Ireland. So Table 6 shows FTC underspending per year in Northern Ireland, and it shows that Northern Ireland performed worse than both Wales and Scotland in terms of FTC spending. Table 7 then outlines the Executive's FTC usage. It shows that the majority of the funding was allocated to the University of Ulster, co-ownership housing and the Northern Ireland Investment Fund and a number of smaller schemes. It should be noted that only a few Northern Ireland departments actually use FTC, and that's in part due to the fact that some departments do not currently have the statutory capability to make loans to the private sector. Where that is the case, the lead department then channels the funding through the Executive Office or the Strategic Investment Board.
I think it's at Ulster University.
And it should be noted further that the Department of Finance is currently progressing a financial provisions bill, which amongst other things will seek to ensure that departments like DFE and DOF can administer FTC going forward. We were able to identify a number of challenges relating to FTC usage in Northern Ireland. So first of all, similar to Wales, the FTC allocation is not stable due to the unpredictable allocations via Barnett consequentials throughout the year, and this variance makes planning difficulty and adversely affects financial management. Specifically to Northern Ireland, political instability, so obviously we've had periods of interrupted devolution. Moving on then to we have legislative barriers because some of the departments can't actually lend to the private sector. There's also some private sector resistance, so not engaging with this funding option because it has to be paid back, and that's unlike grants which don't have to be paid back. And then we've got staff capability, so there's an apparent lack of departmental commercial or market expertise and experience in assessing risks relating to loans and general capital project management. And then there's no dedicated FTC Northern Ireland executive strategy in place. We reached out to the departments and they've added a couple of additional challenges. So internal capability, so it's like the skills to develop and lend out. Affordability, so there's a high level of scrutiny required, and it's more expensive than commercial loans. And then the time frame, so the funding has to be used within the financial year. And then finally, DOF added that there was an issue with finding suitable private sector projects in general.
Thank you very much.
We'll move on over to Karen.
Second paper, and then we'll group questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So for the second part of the presentation, I'll provide an overview of the range of the financial models that are available to support capital regeneration programmes, with some examples of where they've been used successfully in other countries. As you can see in your committee packs, I've provided an overview of financial models that could be worth considering for government-backed capital redevelopment projects. The paper provides a summary of some of the most common models, with some examples of the advantages and disadvantages associated with each one. I've also provided some case studies in the paper as well of the models, to give you an idea of where they've been used in the world. The OECD found that access to private finance for large-scale capital regeneration programmes is very important for most countries, and many countries experienced large-scale infrastructure investment gaps, so it's not just Northern Ireland. There are a wide range of finance options that are available to both local and central government, and these could be considered to help address the gaps. So just because of the time that's available today, I'll just provide a quick overview of a few of them. Probably the most well-known, certainly in the UK, model would be public-private partnerships, or PPPs, and they've been used quite extensively. PPP is a broad term that refers to any collaboration between the public and private sector to deliver public services or infrastructure. It covers an arrangement where the public and private sectors collaborate to deliver or build the infrastructure, and it allows the private sector financing, building and operating of facilities, while the public sector ensures that public services are continued to be delivered. There are a number of advantages with PPP. It enables government to undertake large-scale projects without the full amount of funding required being immediately available, as the private sector partners contribute financially. It allows the government to leverage skills, expertise, innovation and efficiency from their private sector partners. And PPPs are generally regarded as being efficient because they're often brought in within time and to budget, and therefore they can maximise the value for money that can be achieved. And on the same hand, the risk of project overruns and delays are then shared between the public and private sectors. There are, however, disadvantages. PPP arrangements often involve highly detailed and complex contracts, and it can take a large amount of time and resources to successfully negotiate and manage these. PPPs may provide some upfront financial relief, but there's some commentators have said that they can be more expensive in the long term due to the need for the private sector to continue to have a profit whilst they're being run. And also the contractual obligations that would be associated with that can therefore reduce any potential value for money to the public sector. Also, because there's private companies involved, it can also reduce the transparency and accountability of how public funds are being used compared to projects that are purely publicly funded. There's quite a few good examples of PPP projects across Northern Ireland, such as the rebuilding of the Belfast Met College in Titanic, and there's schools such as Wellington College and Torbank Special School. But one of the biggest PPP projects across the UK was the redevelopment of St Bart's Hospital and the Royal London project, and it was a £1.1 billion project which also relied on a £250 million investment by the European Investment Bank. It was a huge project, involved the redevelopment and rebuilding of 13 buildings and the construction of a 17-storey building in the centre of London. But the redevelopment of the hospital and its associated buildings contributed to the regeneration of quite a run-down area of East London. And the project, when it was completed, was then run by its private sector partner, it's been regarded as being successful for both regenerating local communities and providing NHS services. So, as you can see, PPP is an example of some huge projects that have been delivered across the UK. Tax increment financing and community infrastructure levies are also a potentially useful model to consider. They're quite similar models of financing for infrastructure and regeneration projects. Both models support community development and infrastructure projects. The former, the TIFs, if you like, rely on capturing tax increments in the future, and the later places a direct charge on new developments at the start of the development. TIFs are a public financing model that have been used as a subsidy for regeneration and infrastructure projects across many countries, including the United States and Canada. In fact, I think they might have first started off in like the 60s or 70s in California. The aim of TIFs is to stimulate private investment in areas that require regeneration and to increase the value of these areas, so that they stimulate a private sector investment that would not have occurred without the government-backed support. The key principle is that the public sector raise the finance for enabling the projects by pledging to meet the debt repayments from future incremental revenues and other income that could be a result of the development by both the public and private sector. There are a number of different ways in which the funding can be provided. Government can borrow against the anticipated income to assist in the cash flow. The developer can borrow against its anticipated income, which is then reimbursed by the authority, whether it's central or local government. Local people investing in the scheme through a local authority bond, which is issued, can be serviced by the anticipated uplift in business rates, potentially with tax relief if specific laws are in place to allow that to happen. The community infrastructure levies are quite similar, except a levy is placed on the developers or the landowner by local authorities to fund the infrastructure and community amenities such as schools and parks. Currently, that format of a community infrastructure levy is only applicable in England and Wales. As you can imagine, there are some advantages and disadvantages. Some of the advantages include that the TIFs capture locally generated incremental public sector revenues, such as like non-domestic rates, that would not have arisen without their regeneration, so it's considered as completely additional. Additional private sector investment is attracted as the public sector pledges to meet debt repayments from future incremental revenues, and other income is created by the redevelopment within the public and private sector. TIF arrangements are regarded as a useful way to kickstart regeneration in specific areas when no other source of funding is available. And over the long term, TIFs can increase the tax base by making public regeneration projects more viable, and it's regenerating derelict areas. Some of the disadvantages include they can create an over-reliance in one tax stream, because there's a need to ensure that there's a sufficient amount of commercial property within the area being regenerated, and that can mean that the redevelopment area can be heavily skewed towards commercial properties and can make it maybe more high density development than would be ideal. Also, TIFs rely on anticipated cash flow, for example, from the business rates. So there must be certainty that the development will be both completed and occupied within reasonable timescales. And I suppose another drawback that you might consider, and this is common against a lot of regeneration projects, is that they can lead to gentrification of areas, meaning that the residential aspects of the development can become unaffordable to low-income families, which is against maybe the stated aims and objectives. Other considerations, if the TIF zones, because they're set out in specified areas, if they're too big, they may capture revenue from areas that would have been appreciated in value regardless of whether they had been brought into that zone or not. So it's like the ripple effect of regenerating a small area. The areas around it may become naturally regenerated without the extra investment. There are some good examples of where TIFs and community infrastructure levies have been used successfully. The Greater London Authority used both TIFs and community infrastructure levies to fund regeneration in Battersea and Nine Elms development in the Royal Docks. This was a huge piece of redevelopment. It involved 1,600 acres of land, and it all kicked off in 2011 when the UK government announced support for the extension of the Northern Line, on the tube train, and then an associated new enterprise zone around Battersea, around the old power station. So in 2012 then the government confirmed that borrowing up to £1 billion from the Public Works Loan Board would be made available, and that would be serviced by incremental business rates, and they were retained by the local authority for the new enterprise zone for at least 25 years, and contributions from local developers and community infrastructure levies, so that any surplus income could be used to fund other economic priorities. Treasury also agreed that each borough would be statutorily required to pass 100% of their business rate uplift over to the local authority. They would get 100%, Treasury would get 100%, and 30% would be handed back to them. So there's that. It's very long term, but there is a sort of guaranteed income stream then. And another model that I thought would be useful to highlight to you this afternoon is the blended finance approach. It is when there's a strategic combination of private and public sector investment, and it involves the pooling of resources from various stakeholders, and it's often used for large-scale infrastructure or redevelopment projects. And a blended finance approach can be very tailored to meet the specific needs of the project and to meet the expectations of the investors involved, both the private sector and public sector. Combining public and private sector funding to de-risk investments and attract private capital to projects with significant social or environmental benefits. So there are a number of benefits associated with blended finance. It's now a widely recognised and well-tested model across the UK, so it is regarded as credible. Government can ensure value for money by establishing outcome-based contracts whereby payments are issued based on the achievement of pre-agreed outcomes. It can also increase private sector investment into projects that would have otherwise been regarded as too risky by the private sector. However, as you can imagine, there are also disadvantages. A high level of skill and capacity is required to structure and effectively manage blended finance funds. And should the use of blended finance approaches in the UK be scaled up, the Audit Office said that a new Treasury oversight and expertise unit would be required to ensure efficient coordination and the necessary skill building. There's a few good examples across the UK where that's been used, including the Renaissance National Homeless Property Fund, and they used a blended finance approach and a social impact to develop a social impact investment company. and it invests in properties which are then refurbished and leased back to housing experts to provide affordable housing. As with all the different finance models, there's a lot of factors that need to be considered. In addition to considering the specific aims and objectives of the specific project, you also need to consider political, economic, financial and social context that the project is operating in. There are regulatory, legal and governance considerations. I know that Rachel had mentioned some of them. They also apply to FTCs as well. Regulatory issues would include, things like procurement, any arrangements arising from Brexit, environmental considerations, legal compliance issues, state aid and subsidy control, planning laws. If you're thinking of setting up a special purpose vehicle, there's a whole raft of other legislation that has to be considered. The governance of these projects, and what are the oversight mechanisms that have been established? Is there any legislation relating to the financial transparency? And of course tax implications of the preferred financial tool also needs to be considered. For any of the projects you would consider regardless of the financial model chosen, you'd also have to consider factors such as statutory community consultation requirements or any social value frameworks that may be considered. So I suppose really in summary, as the OECD noted, there are a wide range of actions that governments can take to encourage private sector investment in public capital projects, particularly those aimed at regeneration. Given the increasingly constrained budgetary and economic outlook across the United Kingdom, the need for private sector investment is even more acute. Each of the finance models has their own advantages and disadvantages, and again, as Rachel noted, there is a need to ensure that there's the correct level of financial skill, investment management skill and project management skill should any of these different models be taken forward. There was a few points that you might wish to consider as set out in your pack. Really, what private financing models have the executive or the individual departments considered before when designing regeneration projects? Has the executive or the individual departments considered using, blended finance models with other forms of private financing on any single capital regeneration? What were their perceived advantages and disadvantages for each? Has there been any written guidance made available to the executive or the departments on the range of public finance models when designing and implementing capital regeneration projects? Is there any learning available to the Northern Ireland Civil Service to increase its skills, knowledge and understanding of these finance models? Also, given that the National Audit Office highlighted the need for a stable and predictable pipeline of infrastructure projects, is there a single source of potential capital projects that the departments would wish to take forward but have not yet done so because of funding constraints? So that's over and above the SIB's pipeline of projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both of you. I think both are excellent pieces of research. It's great to have them. It's something that we've very much been looking at as a committee in terms of, we're looking into really difficult budget situations, and is anyone considering what other ways we can finance? I think you've got some excellent case studies in there as well. There's a lot of detail, and I think that we'll certainly get back into the detail of these as we work in the round. But I just wanted to pick up on one point, Rachel, I think you had raised it, that there's no strategy in Northern Ireland around the FTC, and there was a lack of expertise. So I just wondered, is there anything in the pipeline in terms of bringing forward a strategy or to address the skills in this.
A throwaway comment in the draft investment strategy in 2022, and obviously it's still a draft. I'm not sure if I think I have a comment in the paper.
Is that the one that says that it should be in the fiscal framework?
Yeah. Yeah, the draft investment strategy of 2022 basically says the medium-term infrastructure finance plan will include an assessment of all other sources of public finance, including FTC.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of alluded to the fact that it would be forthcoming, but it's obviously still in draft form.
I think it's something, because we've raised it, I know, in the committee a couple of times. I think it's something for us as a committee to maybe highlight and take forward around that. So just bring in members. Steve Aiken.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, and thanks again for an excellent brief. And yeah, we've come to expect it, but well done again. Thanks very much indeed. Just two things. The Welsh and Scots on FTC seem to have exactly the same problems and concerns that we've raised all the way, but actually spent it all. So I'm just looking at sort of all the figures. I was just looking at comparing some of the figures over the last sort of a couple of years. They've made very clear that they're going to spend it no matter what. Mm-hmm. So they weren't going to hand any money back. So did you identify any reason why the Welsh and the Scots took that approach, bearing in mind it was just as complex to them and we didn't?
I think there's two issues. Firstly, they both had help to buy schemes and focused that larger section of investment on that, because that's sort of an easier way to do it. In Northern Ireland, we had a lot of smaller schemes which were harder to manage and harder to sort of get the money out the door. The second
You mean as opposed to give all the money to Ulster University?
Yeah, well, it's good to have larger projects, but it probably wasn't the best larger project to use.
Yeah.
The other issue is it's something that we put in our training modules at the start of the mandate. I'm not sure if you remember.
Yeah.
And we had a table and it showed the underspends and the money that we handed back, and we colour coded it red, yellow, and green as to when we had an executive or for the full year, when we had no executive for the full year, or when we had an executive for part of the year. And there was a big correlation to when we had no executive, because you can't then carry the money forward and you can't make any decisions. So that was a hugely influential factor in why we've handed back large chunks of money at certain times. And things like the draft investment strategy, it's still in draft form from 2022. In Scotland and Wales, they don't have sort of issues with things like that because they don't have this interrupted evolution like we do. So I think that is a contributing factor. And then the types of projects that we've chosen to use. Yeah,
because my second question was things like TIFs and the SPVs. I mean, they really have to be very large projects to make sense of, because there are very complex financial mechanisms to be able to look at it and sort of look at the approach. So, it's difficult to see in Northern Ireland unless somebody decided to take Northern Ireland Water and turn it into an SPV. Mm-hmm. And, that's the level of investment you would need to be able to do that. Because even something like sort of Tribeca or some of the other things that people are talking about, the figures don't seem to be large enough to be able to make it to work. Mm-hmm. So we really need to think big if we're going to use this. Would that be a sort of fair comment?
I think we need to think big. I think we also need to get our capability up on the FTC, which is a smaller amount of money, and sort that out before we sort of transfer that knowledge and understanding over sort of more complicated ways of financing.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, is there, I don't know if this is right or not, you looked into this a bit more than me. I don't know if the Welsh have simplified it a bit more by the fact that a lot of their money was put into their development bank.
Yeah, they use that as well. We do have we have our own sort of version of that for smaller projects. They sort of, most of their money went on the Help to Buy scheme, but they did filter money through the Development Bank for Wales as well for the smaller projects.
Yeah, and my final question, with your indulgence, Chair, is obviously the Welsh and the Scots have created development banks specifically to deal with the problem we were dealing with earlier on today with access to funds for SMEs, because they weren't getting it through the normal banking process. So actually the state themselves or the regional government set up a banking system to be able to lend money to the SMEs and to be able to do that as an avenue to the rest of it. But we've never looked at that, have we?
No, I don't. Not for SMEs, no.
Okay. It just ties in, Chair, with what we were discussing earlier on about we had evidence from other people who just basically said they can't get money out of the banks. So it's just a potential option there. But
Thanks, Steve. Jerry Carroll.
Thank you very much. Apologies if I missed it already, but the FTC, the percentage paid back on the loan, is it standard in each loan, or it's altered?
You pay back 100% of what you have, but then as a devolved administration, we have an agreement. So in the first year, I think it was like 60%, and it was to go up to 80%. But it's an agreement between each devolved administration and Treasury for the level of money that goes back to Treasury. And obviously, you recycle funds as well within that. So money that you get back in from your partnership, you can reuse.
So the option of setting it at a different level.
But 100% of money that goes out the door to within the partnership would need to come back.
Okay. And thanks for the PPP briefing, was really useful, because I'm glad the criticisms were covered as well, because I think some of the research I looked at a while ago was saying I think £1 million a day was being spent on paying back PFI and PPP. There's a few years ago now, so it might have increased. I've seen there's a figure there saying there's 4.4 billion more in the value of buildings being paid back over the next 20 or so years. And there's also been, I think, some reporting of problems with maintenance work being covered in that. And I think it's very interesting, because obviously it's sometimes, thrown out as an alternative, as a way to kind of cover the financial issues, but actually it can cost us more in the long run.
It probably goes down to the skills and expertise of establishing the contract with the private sector, and how that whole financial arrangement has been made in the first place, and then how how the contract is then managed over the long term as well.
The final point is, for me, it's like, it shows really we don't live in a free market society. It's like the state is backing up and giving handouts in many ways, or contracts, depending on how you view it, to organisations. So through FTC, obviously, in some ways, and through PPP. But thanks for that. That's very useful.
Thank you, Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Jarrett, and thank you both for that presentation. It was really useful, and Rachel in particular. The information around the undersleds in Scotland and Wales, I think, was a really good comparator, because we're often told by the department that this is a problem across the UK, but obviously in relative terms it is a much bigger problem in Northern Ireland, and so that doesn't entirely stack up. Just one question first of all on the FTC, and that is, and you've covered this already a little bit with Steve, are there any schemes that Scotland and Wales are utilising in respect of FTC that in the course of your research thought would be sort of obvious contenders for Northern Ireland to explore?
I think the most obvious one is to make more of the housing scheme. I know there was issues with legislation, and I think those issues have been resolved. But I think that's what it was set up for in England. We're getting the Barnett consequential because of that. They don't have any issues with spending that sort of money. And Scotland and Wales' first protocol was to go for those Help to Buy schemes, or the equity schemes. So I think the first protocol is to maybe bottom out that. I think the rural loans is a really interesting one. I don't know if it's realistic for Northern Ireland, but I think it's definitely worth someone sort of looking into further. If we, in the next couple of years do run into problems with the fact that money is no longer ring-fenced and the money is still being set aside by the executive for that, if that were to become an issue going forward, it's maybe something we should look into. But I think that the smaller scheme, obviously the development banks are also really good examples, and maybe that needs to be looked into further. But I think the smaller schemes are sort of, they were set up at the time probably to use funding at the end of the year, which is what we sort of do all of the time. Yeah. So I would maybe look to the smaller ones, but those three bigger areas might be worth looking into further.
No, that's really useful, and to be honest, I hadn't appreciated the interrelationship between the removal of agricultural ring fence and the potential for us to do something in that space, because it's always kind of rural development that suffers as a result of Northern Ireland trying to plug that gap. So that is useful. And just on the PPP, PFI side of things, Karen, I mean, in your research, did you come across sort of particular sectors where those arrangements worked well and others where it didn't? I mean, I remember looking previously at some experiences of prison service in England where PFI had clearly, utterly failed and was completely inappropriate. Are there any clear examples or trends that you came across in that respect?
Not really. I mean, as Jerry pointed out, there has been, notable examples of where, in the long term, the PPP and PFI have actually cost, the government more in the long term. And if you dive into that, it seems to be fall back to, loosely written contracts.
Yeah.
And then, other unforeseen things. I think the thing is, whilst PPP seems to have worked in terms of it got things built, it got infrastructure, it got schools built, hospitals built quickly that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So therefore, if they hadn't have been built, there's an opportunity cost there as well, which isn't always taken into account. But we also seem to have, there's other models have come forward, the likes of the TIFs and the blended finance models. They seem to have overtaken the PPP approach.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
I suppose the other thing maybe I should mention in relation to the housing is that I don't know if it's of any help or not, but I know the Help to Buy scheme in Wales was evaluated, and it was the Welsh Government had regarded it as being quite successful, and that was a number of years ago, so I know that that's probably why the funding continued to go into that scheme.
Yeah, that's useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Frey?
Just on that, because that's a very good point. We were speaking to Welsh politicians only a matter of weeks ago when they were over a joint venture, and they had said to me about the massive issue Wales has with regards to house prices, with regards to relative comparisons with regards to wages compared to here and in England. So Wales has a massive problem with house pricing. Would it be the case that the Help to Buy scheme has contributed to that house price? So whilst you could look at it as a success because it was a big uptake in money, but it has actually had unintended consequences?
The National Audit Office actually did a review of the English Help to Buy scheme, and it wasn't so positive. Some of the comments were things like, they were lending people lending people money that probably didn't need it.
Yes.
So yes, it was successful in that everything was spent, but they were lending people money that didn't need to do that. They could have got a commercial loan, or they could have gone down another avenue. So I guess you need to look at the angle of success.
Yeah. To me, it's far too blunt an instrument to basically use. We've spent this money as a target. I think we need to get away from setting financial targets and look at the circumstances and the output and what we achieve, as opposed to saying we're successful because we've spent all 100 million of.
I guess because the other jurisdictions have Help to Buy schemes in place for a long time, you can look at the successes and failures of that when you're sort of doing it yourself.
Yeah.
Learn from it.
To adapt, so that you're not running.
The Scottish money, the Scottish Government's use of FTC, you have a Help to Buy scheme, but then you've also a shared equity first home fund. What's the difference?
I don't know, and there wasn't any publicly available information, and when we contacted the research officers in the Scottish Parliament, it was also really hard to sort of disentangle it, because they don't actually have an issue spending the money each year. It's not something they've really looked into very much. So you're getting to the point where you would need to contact the Scottish Government.
Yeah. Again, that comes back to a financial target of spend.
Well, I wonder as well, because in each jurisdiction the Help to Buy schemes are different. They've been set up very differently.
Yeah.
So certainly in Wales, the Help to Buy scheme, one of the aims of it was to help sustain the building sector, the construction sector, because it started way back in the financial crash, 2009, 2010.
Yes.
And one of its aims and objectives was to continue the employment levels in that sector. So Help to Buy was only available in new homes. So it's possible
It is different in each
that the
jurisdiction.
those two Scottish models, one's for new homes and one's for first-time buyers.
I think one is for developers and builders, and one is for people who are buying homes. I think that's.
It strikes me that this is the way we really need to go with regards to the issues that we've had around borrowing in the housing executive, the issues around the housing need. And it's so difficult for young people growing up now to purchase a house or a mortgage. So difficult compared to what it would have been in our day. I would really feel for them, including 3 of my own.
Some of them are still young.
You're a different generation. So it's something. I think it's the direction we need to point towards. Just making sure that we get it right and stay away from a financial target of having to spend just for the sake of spending. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you both very much for that briefing. It was great, and as I say, there's a lot of detail in those papers, and we'll maybe come back to you again on some of the details. But thank you very, very much for coming and briefing us today, taking the questions on that. Oh, sorry, Steve.
Chair, just a quick one. I mean, that was really interesting points that we picked up about the development banks in the Welsh and the Scots, and lots of questions about the housing. Bearing in mind the relationship we've now developed with the Welsh and Scottish committees, could we write to the Welsh and Scottish committees and get their opinion on it?
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the basic questions is, what is the difference between your Help to Buy scheme and your first home fund?
Yeah, it would be good to get that clarity. We're happy to...
Because that's big numbers in both of those bars, you know.
Sure. On that one as well, I'd like further clarity because I'm interested in the acquiring of land in terms of social housing providers, because obviously we reclassify them as well. So is that the potential here and an extension to that? If it's the housing providers bringing forward or a plan for the FTC, could that include infrastructure spend that would align to the housing programme potentially as well? So I'd like to get more. I think it was the Welsh model, the Welsh FTC. Yeah. Could we get more info on that?
Yeah, I think we're agreed. Everyone's happy. We're going to follow up on those couple of points. Yeah, thank you very much, and again, thank you both. So just moving on to agenda item 9 is our correspondence. Item 9.1, the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Community Asset Transfer. Refer members to page 158 of the meeting pack. The ERA Committee has written to this committee to ask if we've undertaken any work or briefings in relation to funding for community asset transfer, if we have any details of the numbers and types of successful projects stemming from community asset transfer, and if we're aware of the Department of Finance undertaking any work in connection with the development of a land fund. I would ask for members' agreement to forward the Development Trust's briefing paper on a Community Ownership Fund and Community Rights and Empowerment Act to the ERA Committee, which was previously considered by this committee on the 12th of February. Members in agreement?
Agree.
Yeah, thank you. And I would suggest that the latter two questions asked by the ERA Committee are forwarded to the Department for Finance directly for a response. Happy? Thank you.
Yep.
So agenda item 10 is our draft forward work programme. I refer members to the draft forward work programme at page 177 of the meeting pack, and hand over to Peter.
So, Chair, members will recall that we've got everything in place for the banking evidence session next week. We've 8 representatives. We've managed to make that work in the Senate chamber. We're ready to go on that. We've had a briefing paper already, so everything's in place. That will go out in the pack then on Friday. And what we'll do is we'll put the outputs from the Ministers' Banking Roundtable in the pack as well, because that's very good at highlighting the issues that we have really seen emergent through the themes in the evidence sessions so far. We'll also write a wee bit around that, so it gives members a good idea of what's been covered and kind of what there really is to focus on with the banks. Then we've had a cancellation from Social Enterprise NI. We've had a wee bit of trouble scheduling this. A clash has come up for them with an advisory panel for the Economy Minister, which I have said to them is a priority, really. They need to be at that. So we look to reschedule that briefing instead. That's one of the inquiry briefings. If members are content, so we drop the 30th scheduled and we look for another one. Balmoral Show, we've gone back to engagement and they've given us a slot of 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. on the 14th of May. That's obviously the Wednesday committee meeting time. So we'll look at surveying. We're kind of thinking in 2 directions on that, Chair. One around the banking inquiry and possibly something more general that members might want to pick up on and other issues that they might want to survey with kind of the wider public. We're conscious that it's not just farming per se. It's small businesses. It's a lot of footfall. There's a lot of traffic at the show now that maybe wouldn't have been there in previous years. The site at the Maze is massive and you do get a vast number of people. So it's a really good opportunity to get people through and ask lots of general questions. So we're going to come up with some ideas on that. We'll run them past members then next week so we can go ahead and get that prepared for that session. We also now have final confirmation that our report on the 25-26 budget will get a slot, has now got a slot after our joint event motion slot on Tuesday the 8th of April. So it's a double session, I'm afraid, for members. So we'll have the joint event report first. That was obviously done in conjunction with the Economy Committee, and then straight after that we have our report on our round robin with the other committees in terms of the 25-26 budget. So just to highlight that to members now, if they want to think about that and get that in diary, so they come immediately before the adjournment debate on that Tuesday, that final Tuesday. The reports are...
Sorry, through the chair, Peter, are they going to be timed?
We've asked for an hour and a half for each.
Yeah.
I think anything beyond that, we would have been pushing our luck. We had to debate a little bit with the business office. They wanted to try and have the second one in an hour, and it just isn't possible.
No way.
Each committee chair will want to speak in that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that would have just been way too tight, because it allows a bit of flexibility then for other members to talk.
We've got an hour and a half
as well. So an hour and a half, well, that's what we'd asked for. That was the minimum we thought we could get away with. I think if we'd been asking for longer than that, they wouldn't have scheduled it, and we really need to get it done before Easter for it to be meaningful.
Is the Minister going to speak twice?
So we have yet to get a readout from the department as to whether the Minister will respond. The way they're written and the way they've always been written is we highlight issues to the Minister. We would hope that the Minister would respond, but it's unlike other motions where there is a set of recommendations, etc., that the Minister needs to respond on. But we would anticipate that the Minister would want to respond, but we seek confirmation on that one. Those are probably the ones that I want to highlight for now. So there's a few other wee bits and pieces we bring next week, but that's pretty much for today.
Yeah, Paul?
Yeah, can I just ask, is there any solidification on the Estonia trip, just to get in our diaries?
We haven't a date. We have a general timescale of probably early September. We've got a bit of background, because members will recall the Scottish Committee has been. Yeah. So they have a pre-prepared, agenda, people to contact. So we could very nicely slot into very similar meetings that they have done. But what I'd probably like to do is just have a quick bit of a closed session with members on what would suit best for diaries, and then we go from there. Ideally, we want to be into bookings by earlier part of June, really. So we will come back with dates for that, but we're probably looking at early September this year.
So early September will probably have to be, because there's conference season then, mid-September.
We need to work our way around that.
Yeah.
The ideal probably would also have been for members' flexibility to go before the start of the session.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I'm hoping that would also probably avoid the conference season too.
Yeah, sure. Well, it would. Yeah.
So that was kind of our thinking, because it just, I appreciate then that members aren't having to try and work around plenary either. Yeah, but
sure.
we'll get a session and we'll talk that through, so that we can put that in diaries and create a slot, create a bit of a slot for members to kind of work around.
Okay, thank you. I seek members' agreement for the forward work plan. Our programme, as discussed, to be published on committee web pages. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 11. Any other business? Have any members any other business to raise? No. Okay, thank you. Then the date, time, and place of the next meeting. The next committee meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, the 9th of April, at the earlier time of 1 p.m. in the Senate Chamber Parliament buildings. Just at this point, I want to thank again the Clarke team for all their hard work in arranging this. Visit down to the banking hub and up here as well. Thanks to Hansard, and thanks to the sound team for all of their work as well. And also just a thanks to the Kilroy Arms Hotel for their work and cooperation with this, and all those banking representatives, and Heather and Amy at the banking hub as well.
Chair, it would be remiss of me not to thank all of those here on the ground who have helped us. People have been so kind, so generous with their time, and the welcome we've had has been absolutely tremendous. It's been a really good day, and local people have made that. So
no, it's great to have you all in Kilkeel. So thanks again for coming down. It's great to see a great show of MLAs here. So I put the question that the committee meeting does now adjourn. Thank you.